start us off by clarifying what is meant by defund the police?
Defund the police as a concept really, or as a slogan, you can think of it, comes right after what I'm calling the first, Black Lives Matter. It was at that point that many movements began to try to figure out how to engage with the police as an institution and begin to make arguments, not just in terms of reforming, but actually changing the institution entirely. So out of that comes this defunding claim and the defunding argument. That then sets the stage so that this second BLM begins to wake up a lot more people. It gets much more generalized. People begin to look for ideas, and these ideas that were already there pop up. The basic idea is that reform has been tried for a long time. Reform in relation to diversifying leadership in police departments, creating de-escalation training, just a variety. I can give you a slew of different kinds of trainings that have been tried to be implemented over the last 30 years in the United States, particularly, and people felt like it hasn't stopped some of the inequalities. It hasn't stopped some of the killing of young Black people, particularly Latinos or indigenous people. And so therefore, we need to look at something else. So the idea is to actually shrink the police and actually remove their budget. And the way that I've been hearing it lately is that we need to de-invest to reinvest. So the idea is to de-invest from police, grab their budgets, reduce them significantly, and grab that money and put it in different areas and other areas that can engage perhaps mentally ill individuals, healthcare, other things like that.
Could you explain your view on the relationship between the police and a capitalist system more broadly?
The way that I tend to think of police as an institution is that the police are an institution in charge of maintaining the status quo, meaning that they are in charge of social order. That's the function of police that's been around from the beginning, right? As an institution, making sure that things maintain the way that they are. And that means that the police have to do that for whatever system that we're in. That means that if we're in a segregated system, the role of police is to maintain segregation. If we're in a communist system, the policing is going to maintain a communist system. So the role between police and capitalism is that it is the role of police to help maintain the social order. And if the social order is capitalism, then that's the order that is maintained. So therefore, what do we see in these particular kinds of societies? We see a really strong tendency to protect property, to protect the kinds of things that are required in order for capitalism to continue functioning on a daily basis. So police in this particular system then has to maintain the order and ensure that the social order is maintained on a daily basis, so the transactions that occur in a capitalist society occur without being bothered into those. So the question that the police are just maintaining the law doesn't say anything about justice, because the law and justice are not always aligned. We change and those things move. The other question that I was asked recently was, what kind of social order are the police maintaining now? And it's like, oh, that one's hard to see, right? That's the capitalist order. It is not a segregated order, right? The order now is the increasing inequality that we have, a separation of that. A racial order that is not legally, it's not imbued in the law like it was, but it still has a separation between in different parts of the United States in relation to race. Some of it is white, black, some of it is white Latino, some of it is white indigenous, right? Different parts of the United States have different configurations of that, but there is still that separation, and those things and the police are still engaged in relation to making sure that those kinds of hierarchies are maintained.
With things like a critique on capitalism itself, and like we said before, how much that is inherent in the world that we don't see, actually, in fact, because it's just our everyday world. What do you think are the biggest challenges for trying to implement this transition into different ways of thinking? So take, for instance, the idea of diverting money away from the police and into, say, better standards of education, better psychological counselling maybe for young people as they're going through this very difficult stage in their life, and make sure that they stay on track with their education. Do you think that potentially one challenge is the fact that the results of that may take longer to see? For instance, may take a generation or may take 10 years or something along those lines. In terms of those types of challenges, what do you see as the biggest challenge for achieving this transition?
Okay, so I'm hearing the question in two ways. One is, it's a question about change. change, and that is, how does change occur, and how is change going to go, how are we going to go from here to there? And I hear that change, one is consciousness and one is structural and institutional. Part of my answer is that change, at least in consciousness, probably happens a little faster than we imagine. The Black Lives Matter, the second Black Lives Matter wave that we just experienced, changed things faster than anything I could have ever written or said or done. I don't necessarily condone this, but I want to say people burning things down and throwing bricks for some reason creates a ground that changes things. Again, I don't want to say that like I condone it. I'm saying it like a social scientist that's noticing it. I'm noticing that the kinds of ideas that were prevalent 2 months ago versus what happened, this occurs, and then 2 months later is unbelievable. The change is unbelievable. I have been asked to speak with local papers, to national papers in relation to police abolition or police defunding. I've been talking about this and thinking about this for years. I've never been asked about it, ever, So that tells me that it's unbelievable that some of the ideas that seem relatively fringe and interesting to me because they were happening here on this corner of the world, and I'm studying them in relation to kind of how people are putting things together, all of a sudden become common sense. So to say, for example, we go from a moment where we're talking about perhaps reforming the police to a moment where the city of Minneapolis is talking about disbanding the police. That happened in 2 months. The movement that we've already seen forward in 2 months is beyond my expectations of many years of studying this. So consciousness leaps, and by that I mean perceptions and understandings and the kinds of questions that people ask and the things that they're even willing to consider shift drastically. And the next thing becomes people starting to address those issues and the policies and the changes, and that takes a little longer. But I think that that's now put in place where people are now open to consider policy shifts that never would have been considered, again, 2 months ago. But I'd rather turn the question and say, not to ask what's stopping us, but like, watch how quickly this developed. So my guess is that change can occur that way. Not always, and we can't count on it, and we can't create it. That is just something we do socially. And when those moments occur, we have to jump on it because it will end, right? It's this particular moment, people are particularly interested in this, and we have to then engage people, push this as far as we can in relation to the change that creates a more equal society. What I want to point out is, look how quickly it can change. It's already shifting.
How international do you think this issue is? I understand they're place-based issues, but I'm assuming you see them as international issues too.
They are international, but they're international in a complicated way. I think the history and the structure of the specific location just matters so much, right? I think the history of slavery in the United States and the effects and echoes that left in the United States is just it's so specific to the United States that it creates a certain kind of configuration that maybe South Africa can relate to. While it is international, how it manifests in the locality is going to differ. I mean, look at the riots that occurred in Paris, I forget how many years ago. Those were in relation to the police, in relation to young Muslim youth. That seems very familiar, right? It's not the same that it is in the United States. So we can't say that it's the same, but the configuration is a little similar in relation to the dynamics. There is also some of that white and black tension in England, but it's a little bit different because slavery functioned differently. So therefore, the laws and the relations have a more colonial aspect than a slavery aspect in relation to the United States that has this erasure of individuals that, in the United States, the slavery attempted to erase the entire culture of entire people, that then they had to develop their own culture within the United States. My understanding is that in England, people were brought from the colonies, continue to have a connection to the colonies, which creates a different kind of relationship. And therefore, the police and that has a very specific flavor. And the locality, we have to be very specific and very local in relation to that history. That, and also that each society has a different sense of how they build policing, right? England has a different tradition, slightly different origins than we did in the United States. We have the origins of the slave patrols and the origins of the Night Watchman, which you guys have too, but we have it in relation to the cities in the north and controlling labor in the cities. That creates this whole structure there that England then has a different tradition. That you add to it armament, guns in that particular given society. If you eliminate guns from that society, and you see things like what you see in England and London, which is the police shootings and killings are drastically lower than the United States. So part of, while international, these specificity things sure make a big difference.
Are there any cities or localities that stand out as particular successes in terms of defunding the police?
This defunding is relatively new. So historically, you got to think of it as the funding for police is just one continuous increase like that over the last 40 years. In the United States, the police unions tend to be relatively strong, and the sentiment for police tends to be very favorable generally, and therefore the funding has not been put into question until now. While the ideas aren't old, the receptivity of it is relatively new enough that some of these ideas are just now starting to take hold and being implemented. So there are not a lot of examples yet, but I think that there will be. In Richmond, California, they created this thing called violence interruption. And the idea is to actually have different teams of people in the community interrupt moments of violence that might be occurring in particular. And this is not in the police, so these are community folks. And they've implemented this, and they're trying to decrease violence by interrupting it in a variety of different ways. They're doing, not there, but in other places, called community emergency response systems. So the police sometimes have to respond to mentally ill people. So you have an individual who's having a mental crisis, and what happens is you call the police. The police are not trained to deal with that necessarily. Some of them are, but not necessarily. They're trained to keep the safety, and if you are dangerous, they will shoot. One of the policies is to create these community emergency response systems where you have different people in the community that are experts in the community in mental health respond to these situations and not the police. So divert the phone calls that go to the police, figure out this thing, have these individuals come in and engage in that. There's other policies like integrated drop-off centers, where they're trying to have individuals that, again, might be having mental breakdowns, and instead of actually calling the police, grabbing them and actually taking them to a designated location and saying, here we go, and then have people in that location actually be trained to deal with that and then de-escalating this. The idea here is the police no longer respond to these aspects. So let's say the police engage with this much issues that are a problem, actually make it so that they're only dealing with that, so that these parts are now being dealt with people that are civilian, that are experts in these particular areas and can respond to that. So these things are being proposed, and they're going to be proposed, I think, in the coming year in many different cities, and we're going to have a lot more evidence in relation to how they function probably in another couple of years.